just black coffee and maybe 12 hours of coma-level sleep. That was the only thing I was asking for as I gripped the steering wheel of my dusty SUV, my knuckles white and my eyes feeling like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper after 42 hours of being wide awake. Fueled by nothing but stale protein bars and the kind of lingering adrenaline that only comes from a messy extraction in the Swiss Alps involving uncooked pasta as a cipher delivery method. And please, don't even ask about the pasta because, honestly, it left me feeling like a mess of frayed wiring. I'd spent 2 weeks dodging some very questionable characters in the freezing cold, and while the Alps are objectively beautiful, when you're worried about a bullet in the back, you tend to lose your appreciation for the scenery. So all I wanted was my bed, my own shower, and a life that wasn't an Oppos, regulated by anyone but myself. But as I turned onto my quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb of Virginia that's supposed to be the definition of, in quote, boring, in quote, the first prickle of unease hit me right in the gut, that old familiar instinct that tells you the environment has changed while you were gone. And as I pulled in my driveway, I realized the landscaping, which I pay a ridiculous amount of money for just to maintain that pretentious botanical garden look, was looking wilder, untouched, and there was no mail overflowing the box, no newspaper on the step, nothing. Then I saw the welcome mat, my favorite mat that usually had a snarky comment about having a warrant before you knock, but it had been replaced by this stiff, corporate-looking thing that read, and quote, compliance starts at the door, end quote. And right then, I knew exactly what had happened. The Homeowners Association, or more specifically Linda. Linda was the kind of woman who treated her position as HOA president like she was presiding over the UN Security Council. And as I walked up to my front door, I saw the flicker of movement in the neighbor and Oppo's window, a curtain falling back into place just a little too fast, which sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Swiss winter. I reached for my keys, slid the metal into the lock, but it wouldn't end Oppo's. T-turn, not even a fraction of a millimeter, so I tried it again, flipped it upside down, tried the back door, even the garage keypad, but everything was dead, unresponsive, and for a second, I thought the sleep deprivation was finally making me lose my mind until I saw it, a neon orange sticker plastered right over the new, unfamiliar deadbolt. It read in quote, access revoked by HOA Security Authority, property temporarily seized under Article 12C of Community Code Conduct, end quote. And my brain went from sluggish to DEFCON 1 in a heartbeat, because nobody, especially not a suburban HOA, has the legal right to lock a man out of a house he owns outright. I took a deep breath, looked around the empty street to make sure no one was watching, and then I bent down to flick a piece of bark off my boot, extracting the bent hairpin I always keep tucked in the sole for emergencies, and within 15 seconds of working that lock, I heard the satisfying click that echoed through the quiet afternoon. The door swung open, and immediately a shriek pierced the air from across the street, end quote. You can Oppos do that. That Oppos is a violation of the seizure order, end quote. And there was Linda, standing on her pristine lawn with her hands on her hips, radiating this kind of righteous fury that usually belongs in a courtroom, her jaw practically unhinged because I didn't Oppos to even acknowledge her. I just stepped inside my house and shut the door. I dropped my duffel bag, which smelled faintly of jet fuel and regret, and realized I couldn't Oppos to even enjoy the silence because something felt wrong inside my own walls, a subtle shift in the air, the smell of a perfume that wasn't Oppos mine, and the realization that Linda hadn't Oppos just changed the locks she'd been inside. I didn't Oppos wait for the shower. I walked straight back out and headed for the HOA office, which was really just a glorified shed at the end of the block. And when I walked in, Linda was sitting there behind a faux wood desk, sipping from a mug that said, in quote, I'm Oppos. I'm not bossy, I'm Oppos. I'm authoritative, end quote. And she didn't Oppos to even flinch. She just gave me this tight, smug smile that was so rehearsed it made my skin crawl, end quote. Oh, Jack's back so soon, end quote. She said in that nasal, condescending tone that made me want to grind my teeth, end quote. We noticed your prolonged absence, and the neighbors expressed concerns about the odd hours you keep and the unusual cars that drop you off. So a vote was taken, and you were deemed an Oppos, security risk adjacent and Oppos, by the board, end quote. I just stared at her, trying to process the sheer insanity of those words. And I asked her if those were even real rules, to which she just sniffed and slid a laminated sheet across the desk, listing infractions like, in quote, grass texture inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic, in quote, and in quote, excessive garage security, in quote, which apparently justified them seizing my home while I was on, in quote, vacation, end quote. Then she handed me a temporary visitor pass, a piece of plastic from my own house that expired in 72 hours. And I didn't oppose. T argue, I didn't oppose. TL, I just took the pass and walked out because my brain was finally clicking into gear, and I knew Linda wasn't oppose. T smart enough or bold enough to pull a stunt like this on her own. Someone had coached her. Someone had timed this perfectly for when I got back from Switzerland, and suddenly my quiet suburban street felt a lot less like home and a lot more like a theater of operations. I walked back down the aggressively curved path that Linda had once tried to find me for, realizing that the absurdity of the HOA violations was just a smokescreen, a layer of civilian noise designed to mask something much more professional, because the timing was just too perfect, and as much as I wanted to sleep, I knew I had to do a ground assessment. I didn't oppose T on a dog, but in neighborhoods like this, a man walking with purpose while holding an empty leash is invisible. People just assume you oppose. Were you looking for a runaway pet? So I grabbed an old leash from the garage, looped my thumb through it, and started my patrol. The feeling of being watched intensified almost immediately, and it wasn't an oppose, the in quote, nosy neighbor in quote, kind of watching, it was the in quote, tactical observation in quote, kind of like the delivery truck that lingered a little too long at the curb, or the jogger whose eyes scanned my house with a methodical precision that had nothing to do with cardio. Then I saw it, parked 2 streets over behind a massive oak tree. A white van, generic and bland, except for the 5 mismatched antennas on the roof and the faint outline on the side where a thermal imaging sticker had been poorly peeled off. That wasn't an oppose. T. Gary an oppose. S. Pest Control. And as I got closer, the side door slid open just an inch, and I caught a glimpse of a guy in a professional-grade comms headset who clocked me immediately, slid the door shut, and rolled the van away before I could even get a clear look at his face. I snapped a quick picture of the plate, which turned out to be a dead end, but back at my house, I pulled out my handheld signal detector and did a routine sweep of the living room. And that into oppose. That's when the device went crazy, picking up a low-frequency pulse signal that was too clean, too directional for any consumer electronics. I triangulated the source, and my heart sank when I realized it was pointing straight across the street to a decorative birdhouse perched on top of Linda and Oppo's flagpole, a birdhouse that was clearly wired like a signals intelligence outpost, and that and Oppo's. That's when I knew I needed to call Elias. Elias lived 3 doors down in a house that looked like it was being held together by stubborn ivy and sheer willpower. But inside, it was a digital fortress because Elias was an ex-Navy cryptanalyst who had turned into a semi-retired hacker after a very messy incident in Macau that I'd helped him out of years ago. I found him hunched over 6 monitors, his face glowing in the blue light of scrolling code. And when I told him about the birdhouse and the van, his usual cynical attitude vanished, and his fingers started flying across the keyboard. End quote. Jacks this ISN into Oppos. T amateur hour, end quote. He said, his voice dropping an octave as a new window popped up on his screen, end quote. Someone just tried a brute force entry on my secure gateway the second I pinged that birdhouse relay. They and Oppos. Not just watching you, they and Oppos. Reacting to you. And whoever is routing this data is using a sophisticated relay that leads back to a server in Vladivostok. End quote. My blood ran cold because that meant this wasn't Oppos. T just a neighborhood dispute. It was an active operation, so we decided to hit the HOA office at midnight to see what was really behind that faux wood desk. Elias disabled the security feed loop remotely, and we slipped into that strip mall unit using an old Blockbuster card to jimmy the magnetic lock. And once we were inside, the smell of cheap air freshener couldn't and Oppos. T hide the hum of high-end hardware. Behind a door marked, end quote, HOA compliant storage, end quote, we found a mini NSA outpost. Racks of servers, live feed from hidden cameras aimed at every house on the block, and filing cabinets filled with surveillance logs on residents with federal employment histories. But the real kicker was a folder with my name on it. Not my public name, Jax, but my actual agency designation, the one that only a handful of people in the world are supposed to know. And right then, I realized Linda wasn't Oppos. T just a puppet. She was a local franchise manager for a private intelligence network that was hunting people like me. We found a chat log on a tablet between Linda and someone using the handle in quote, Sable Eagle, end quote, and the messages were chilling, end quote, target still unaware. Local puppet compliant. Interference will be neutralized if necessary. End quote. The timing of the messages spiked 48 hours before I got back from Switzerland, which meant they knew exactly when my mission ended, and they used the HOA lockout as operational cover to get inside my house and plant bugs while I was stuck on the doorstep. I felt a cold, calculating fury rising up in me, the kind of anger that makes you very, very dangerous, and I told Elias that Phase 1 was over. It was time to rattle the cage and force Sable Eagle to show their hand. We called it, in quote, Operation Suburban Showdown, end quote. And the next day at the HOA community cookout, I showed up in the loudest Hawaiian shirt I owned, carrying a tub of store-bought potato salad and acting like the most oblivious, happy-go-lucky neighbor you've ever met. I told everyone who would listen that I'd been off-grid in Montana writing a novel about sentient tree spirits, and I watched Linda's face twitch with absolute confusion as she tried to maintain her smug, end quote, authoritative, end quote, persona while handing out letters about, end quote, voluntary in-home compliance checks, end quote. I spent the next few days feeding total garbage into the listening devices I'd found, talking loudly about fake job offers in Alaska, and discussing non-existent security upgrades with Elias over an open channel we knew they were monitoring, letting them chase ghosts while we prepared the real counterattack. Then came the disruption. I used a signal scrambler Elias built to walk past their camera points, replacing their live feeds with a looped image of a waving squirrel, so they were effectively blind while I moved through the neighborhood. I even hacked the HOA and Oppos, end quote, security drone, end quote, and programmed it to obsessively follow Linda and Oppos, car at a distance of 3 feet, which led to her frantically swerving and screaming at the sky on the neighborhood Facebook group. But the real masterpiece was the weekly yard inspection. I timed a remote command to trigger every smart sprinkler system on the block simultaneously, just as Linda and her committee rounded the corner, and she slipped on the wet pavement, landing squarely in a patch of prize-winning ceramic gnomes, a spectacle that was captured by 3 different neighbors and uploaded to TikTok before she even got her hair dry. They retaliated by killing the ignition on my car, but Elias bypassed it in minutes. And by Saturday, the day of mine, quote, HOA compliant, end quote, backyard barbecue, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I invited the whole neighborhood, filed every permit, and even used pastel-colored decorations to satisfy their ridiculous Rule 7B. And as the neighbors gathered, feeling a strange sense of liberation, I stood up and announced that I wanted to thank Linda for her, end quote, dedication to safety, end quote, by showing a little presentation on our new neighborhood upgrades. Panic flashed across her face as I pulled down a projector screen and started playing a sanitized version of the surveillance footage we'd gathered, showing the hidden cameras in the birdhouses, the data exports to overseas servers, and the logs of their own private lives being recorded. I never mentioned spies, I just let the neighbors connect the dots, and when Linda tried to run to the breaker box to shut me down, she realized I'd wired in a backup generator. So she just stood there, shrieking about traitors while everyone laughed at her. But the real confirmation came that night when Elias tracked a satellite uplink attempt to breach my VPN, a signal that wasn't in Oppos. T-Local. This was Sable Eagle stepping out of the shadows, and we realized the white van had been parking near my house at 12-hour intervals for a personnel swap. We ran a thermal filter on the footage and saw 2 guys carrying a heavy hard case out of a house belonging to a retired postal worker. And it hit me. The Swiss mission, the pasta courier, the lockout. It was all connected to a leak inside the agency. Someone had searched my house for something from the Swiss mission, and when they didn't in Oppos, find it, they tried to frame me using the HOA as a front, so I decided to use Linda's own arrogance as the final lure. I placed a black Pelican case on my porch with a big yellow sticker that said, end quote, classified asset disposal, end quote, And inside, I put entirely fabricated documents that made it look like Linda was a paid contractor for a defunct intel firm. Within 2 hours, she'd stolen the case and ran it straight to her handler. And that's when I saw him on the hidden feed, a man named Bishop, a guy I recognized from my early days at Langley who had gone rogue years ago. I watched on the screen as Bishop told Linda, end quote, "If you talk, you vanish," end quote. And her face went pale, her, end quote, authority, end quote, evaporating into pure, unadulterated fear as she realized she was nothing but a disposable pawn in a game she didn't into oppose, to understand. As Bishop walked out to his sedan, I pulled my plumbing van out and blocked him in the parking lot. And for 2 seconds, our eyes met through the windshield. No words, just the cold recognition of two professionals who knew exactly where they stood. I let him go because I didn't into oppose. Need to catch him yet. I just needed to burn him. And that night, Elias and I sent the encrypted bundles of evidence to the local news, an independent journalist, and a federal contact who owed me a massive favor. By the next morning, the headlines were screaming about end quote, suburban spy ring, end quote, and the neighborhood went into a frenzy, ripping down birdhouses and statues while the HOA board disbanded in a panic. Linda and Oppo's house went dark, and a moving truck cleared it out before dawn. And while Bishop disappeared into the wind, the network he'd built was shattered beyond repair. Weeks later, the neighborhood felt different, scarred, but finally breathing. And even though I received some pointed questions from men in quiet suits about how I uncover a rogue operation so quickly, I just stuck to the story that I was a man defending his home turf. I found 3 more bugs tucked away in my house, one behind a fridge, one in a light switch, and one in the attic. And after a deep cleanse, I installed a security system that would make a bunker look like a screen door. But then a moving truck pulled up to Linda and Oppo's old house, and a woman stepped out that I recognized instantly. Sarah, one of my best trainees from a few years back, and she gave me a professional smile and said she'd heard the neighborhood was finally, end quote, quiet, end quote. I helped her carry a box inside, realizing that Langley had planted a friendly face next door to keep an eye on things. And as I sat on my porch that night, watching the sunset, I realized that locks aren't into oppos. What keep people safe into oppos? That's the people who are willing to watch back. But it makes you wonder, doesn't an oppos? It? When you look at your own neighborhood, at that nosy neighbor with the clipboard or the weirdly placed birdhouse on the corner, do you really know who an oppos is living next door? Or more importantly, do you know who an oppos is watching you when you think you an oppos? Remost alone? Because sometimes the biggest threats dawn and oppos. Come from across the ocean. They come from across the street. And if your HOA suddenly starts asking for, end quote, voluntary compliance, end quote, you might want to check your locks and then check them again. What would you do if you found out your local community board was actually a front for something much darker? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's had a fight for his own front door.